Well, hello again. One of the things that interests me a lot, other than wildlife, is history, and I love seeing old ruins or towns, cities that have a long history and are still intact. At least some of the ancient buildings are intact, and you can see them almost as people hundreds of years ago would have seen them. So this is one of the reasons I moved back to Europe from Australia, because I love the old history. And a trip I did, it was a while back now, it was in 2013, but a friend of mine had suggested doing a cruise around the Mediterranean, and I hadn't done one before, and I thought, well, I'll give it a go, and it means unpacking once and then seeing lots of different places. And it was actually quite fun, and I've not done a cruise since, but if it's something that you're thinking about doing, I'd certainly recommend it. Now, one of the great things about him, we'd actually met in Egypt a few years earlier. We were doing a trip around, essentially down the Nile, looking at ruins from ancient Egypt. So, Abu Simbel, Luxor, all sorts of places like that, and then obviously the pyramids. So he'd arranged this trip, and he was also arranging several side trips, and he asked me where I'd like to go, and I had a couple of suggestions. And so what we did on two occasions. On the first one we actually stopped in Jerusalem, because I was interested in seeing some sights around there. And the ship actually came into port one place in Israel, I can't remember now, and then we headed off. He'd organised somebody to take us around. So we headed off for the day, went and saw a bunch of places, stayed in Jerusalem overnight, which I found quite interesting, in the German Quarter. And then we went off and saw some more things. So there was an opportunity to wander around Jerusalem that evening and the following morning. And then later on in the day, we headed off again, and we met the ship at a different port. So that was quite a cool thing about being on the cruise. And we also did a similar thing in Egypt. The ship came into Alexandria, but we basically left Alexandria when the ship came in, stayed down in Cairo that night, but we actually returned back to Alexandria. So there was a couple of little side trips we did. Another one we did that I want to talk about was in Turkey, and this was visiting the Roman port of Ephesus, which it's not a port anymore for two reasons. One is it's a ruin, and secondly, it's not on the sea because the coastline has changed since Roman times. But one of the things, or the reason I kind of picked Ephesus, is that if you go there, now there's kind of plus and minus about this. In a lot of places you go, there are ruins around, but they're kind of cordoned off, and you can't get ready access to them, and that's good, because I think it's important that we preserve what we can of these buildings. But obviously that also is very expensive. It's costs quite a lot of money to protect these old buildings, to restore them in some cases. That certainly goes on in places like Herculaneum and Pompeii. They're gradually restoring some of the old frescoes and things like that so they're closer to their original condition in some parts of those cities. But not all countries can afford that, and obviously with having tourists come in, that's an important source of revenue to have that kind of conservation work carried out. But it's not always the place. So with Ephesus, because it's actually very big, it is quite a big site. I didn't think to check how it compares to Pompeii. If you've ever been there, Pompeii is large as well. You can. I've been lost in Pompeii, so that's not a particularly good claim to fame, and not a unique one either. But it's quite a large place. So Ephesus is similar. The great thing about Ephesus, though, is that some of the buildings the library is amazing, and that's still there's a large part of it remaining. But also there are mosaics on the ground, and when I was there, you could actually walk on them if you wanted to. I tend not to do that, but you could do that. the thing I did do was just to walk into some of the old houses, and they're in a state of ruin now. They don't have roofs, but you can see the line of the street. You would know they were the front door you were walking through, and then you could work out what some of the rooms were. And the thing I love about that is it's possible to just stop for a moment and try and imagine who was walking through that door maybe 1500, 1800, 2000 years earlier. And, what was behind them, what was in the house, who was there, what was it like in there? Was it light? Was it dark? Was it presumably some of these were relatively lower status dwellings for people, but what were they like? What was their day-to-day life like? And when they stepped out of their home, what were they stepping into? Was it a busy street? What were the smells like, the sounds? I'm sure some of the smells weren't that spectacular, or at least not in a pleasant way, but what are the other things they would have seen and heard? So this is what gives me, one of the things that gives me a buzz about going to old places. What I also like to do is look at buildings. Now, I'm now going to jump to, well, Jerusalem is one place where you can see buildings like this, but there are many, almost any city of any kind of antiquity, if you like, say 100, 200, 300 years old. A lot of them get repurposed, and the things I tend to look at are signs in walls, for example, where there was once a window that's been filled in. So you might have the lintel still there, and the bricks are different where the window once was, or there might be a door that's been filled in, or it might be a large door on an old warehouse that's now being filled in, and the whole building's been repurposed. Even places like Sydney, which, on that kind of scale is quite a relatively new city. If you go down to the Rocks and some of the hotels there and some of the buildings in the Rocks, you can see where they were originally warehouses, and there were these large openings at a sort of first and second floor level, so i.e. not ground floor, but upper level or two, where they would have been putting goods in through the windows. So that was one of the great things about Ephesus. You sort of really had very, very ready access to just experience in a slightly different way some of these places which ordinary people would have lived in. And how many generations lived in that house? Was it the same family, generation after generation, living in the same house? Was it a particular group of workers who might come and go depending on how business was, how food supplies were, all this kind of thing, how well the port was doing, was there conflict, all this sort of stuff that influences people's day-to-day lives. So for me, this is one of the joys of photography. It's getting in there, and I'll take photographs of ruins, if you like, and I like to look at close-ups. I'm not a religious person, but one of the things I do like to visit, not in Ephesus so much, but where I grew up in England, there was an old church, and the thing about churches, and this church would have been probably, I'm just trying to remember now, maybe 500 years old, something like that. The people of that time who were building these things, they were religion played a much larger role in their lives than it does in a lot of our lives these days. A lot of us, myself included, not religious, don't follow a particular set of beliefs, so I don't go to church, that kind of thing. But going back a few hundred years, religion played a very big part in people's day-to-day lives. So any work they did that related to things like churches, they would put literally their heart and soul into what they were doing. And you see the most amazing detailed work. And it's something I love from going around these often little churches certainly in England where I grew up. They would be in little villages or little towns, or even in, this is in a new town where I grew up. It was a place called Hemel Hempstead, which is one of the new towns that was built after the Second World War. But it was built next to a much older town that can be traced back to the Domesday Book, which was 1069, I think. The Domesday book, which was, if you're not familiar, the Doomsday Book, was a survey that the Normans carried out when they conquered the Anglo-Saxons in 1066. So this is William the Conqueror and the Battle of Hastings and all this sort of stuff. But once I'll call it pacify, it was actually quite brutal, the whole process, but once they'd pacified England that they'd conquered, they decided to see what they'd actually got. So they did this, really the first detailed census of, certainly of England, and it listed all of the settlements, villages, everything, and how many people were living there, what animals they had. All of this was to be used for taxation. But it's an amazing document now, looking at it from almost 1,000 years later. So if you're traveling and you go to these old places, I suggest have a look around and look above street level as well. One of the things I like to do is just look up a little bit. Most people tend to look straight ahead of them and frankly don't see much else. So I'm always looking around. I'm looking down, I'm looking to the sides, I'm looking up, and seeing what's there. So going back to Ephesus, that's a slightly different situation because it is a ruin. I mean, it's just a destroyed Roman city. So there was nothing, or the parts that I was looking at, there was no real use made of them once it was abandoned by the Romans. And I don't know the history of Ephesus to really say more about it than that. But it wasn't a place that stayed in constant use for hundreds of years after the Romans left Turkey or were not using the city anymore. So that's one of the things that gives me a buzz. And so again, my recommendation is if you get a chance to look at these places, it's good if you can do a bit of research as well. So I did manage to impress my friend because I was looking at one building we went into, which was in a group of buildings that were being conserved. So they were enclosed and you couldn't walk among the ruins as you could with other parts of Ephesus. But there was a building there with a lot of little pillars of tiles, and I recognised them as the stacks that go up to make a hypocaust, which is essentially it's underfloor heating that the Romans would do. So the and this would be used in a high status building. So the floor would be maybe a metre off the ground, the actual floor level that people would walk on, and it was supported by lots of these little pillars that were built up, and then essentially a piping or a route was made out of that room to a separate building where they had a furnace, and essentially what they did was channel hot air and make it circulate around underneath the floor. So Roman underfloor heating, it was pretty good, but obviously doing something like that is a relatively expensive and complicated, I guess, thing to do, and it required obviously the Romans used slaves, unfortunately, but that was the nature of things. They would use them to constantly service and maintain the hypocaust when it was needed. So obviously you needed it would be in a building that was belonging to somebody of a relatively high status, so quite wealthy, to be able to afford all of that. So there are certain clues that when you begin to look around will point to the use of the building or how it's been reused and repurposed over time. But again, if you look at detail in different buildings, there's some just amazing work there. So this is something I tend to do, and I said in another podcast that I don't do a lot of snaps as such when I'm traveling. I tend to just shoot photographs that I plan to use one way or another, but I don't do sort of snapshots for fun, as it were. It's not that I don't have fun with photography, but what I find is that when I've taken those photographs, I very rarely look at them again. So I just can very easily finish up with thousands of photographs on hard drives or in storage somewhere that I am not looking at, and I tend to be fairly pragmatic about what's happening with my storage. So there you go. So that was really just something that I like to do, and I mentioned Jerusalem, spending a night there. We went to an older part of the city. So I don't know if you know, but Jerusalem was part of its history was destroyed in AD 70 by the Romans, and then it was essentially rebuilt. But some of the old cities survived. I believe that the Wailing Wall, that's obviously very important for people of the Jewish faith. The Wailing Wall is part of that original city, but other parts remain from the older city. And Jerusalem's been destroyed and rebuilt several times in antiquity. But what I could see on one particular street, and it had been cleared, so it was essentially a wall and a pavement and nothing. But what I could see in the wall were just regular, small, sort of square openings. And look, I don't know what they were, but to my eye, I just looked and thought, well, they could potentially be where you would place a support for an awning or something like that. And this was quite a wide street. So rather than being something quite sterile, it may have been a street where there would have been awnings set up and stalls selling one thing or another, or services or whatever it might be. And to my mind, just looking around and imagining how something could have been used begins to bring it alive. And you can almost picture the people rushing to get whatever they needed and then go off to the next thing they were doing. And, much as we do today, people used to get in a hurry in antiquity as well as now, and would be in a rush or forget things or need to get their food or whatever else they were doing. So just ordinary people doing the ordinary things, but in a different time. And this is what I like to look at in those kind of locations. So I'm beginning to feel like I'm repeating myself a bit, so I'm going to stop. But I hope that's given you an idea to look around, if nothing else, when you're in somewhere. Even where you live, it doesn't have to be somewhere unusual. If you live in a place that has been around for a little while, it's always good to acquaint yourself with it and start viewing it as you would somewhere new, because when we go somewhere new, we tend to be taking it all in. Whereas where we live, a place we go every day, there's what's the saying? Familiarity breeds contempt. And I believe it does. And I believe it stops us from really stopping and having a look around and beginning to get a feel for the history. Now, you may be one of those people who's really into local history, and that's fantastic. I absolutely applaud that, because particularly if it's somewhere you've grown up, you are part of that story, at least for this period of time. And it's good to have a sense of what's gone before so that you know how you fit into that story. And I think that begins to make this sort of history, however long it is, much more personal. So again, that to me is interesting. And if you can capture some of that in your photography, and in another podcast I talk about what to do with your photographs, and one of those might be to create a photo book, which could be more of a story, then maybe there's context for you to place your observations that you've made using photographs into something more contextual, say a photo book with a story, and maybe even some personal anecdotes. If you know stories from your own family, maybe you have access to old photographs that you can scan and include there and tie those into the story of the place that you live, or the place that you're doing the photo book about. Anyway, that may well be something that you could do as a project and might be quite rewarding and of interest to not only your family but people who live in the area. So there you go, a few ideas, but I've naturally veered wildly off topic, but I hope you found that interesting, maybe giving you some ideas. So whatever you're doing, I hope you enjoy that and have a great day. And I will speak to you again in the next podcast. So enjoy. I'll speak to you soon. Bye for now. Oh, and one thing just before you go, please take a look at the 2026 wildlife calendar. That's available now. It's on the website. There's a link below the description of this podcast episode. So please take a look, and I'll speak to you next time. Bye now.